the record going. So Tammy, go ahead and take it away.
Hi, I'm Tammy Long, and I'm the fiscal monitor for Title I. It's good to be with you, and I just want you to say that if you have any questions during the presentation, just drop them in the chat, put your hand up, scream out, whatever you want to do. Works for me. So we'll see if we get this going. That didn't work so well. Are you seeing just the screen or are you seeing the slides on the side? Yeah, she's seeing the slides on the side. Got that one. Sure. Okay, well, I'm going to start. My name's Tammy Long, and it's nice to be here with you all. Next slide. So when we come out to monitor, you're on at least an every 5-year rotation. Next slide. And you also can be looked at for risk. So if we find, there's been a problem or alerted to something, or we're not liking what we're seeing, then we may pop out and have a quick chat with the LEAs to see if what they need to help get them in compliance and get them on the right track. If you receive Title I funds 1 year, then we really try to mentor you that first year, and then we will come visit you that second year just to make sure that everything's being done correctly and we have everything in line so that we have no problems. So when we go, we set these up in Utah Grants when we come out to visit. So you get notice from Utah Grants. You will also get notices from Val Murdoch. She's the program person, and she will ask you, what time of day, what day you want, and try to set it up so it's at your convenience for the monitoring visit. And then we send out all these forms in Utah Grants that says, this is what we need for you to provide before we come to the site, so that we have everything we need to present to have a conversation of what's missing or what's needed. So I've listed out the things that are needed, and it's the procurement policy, time and effort policy, and your procedures. And when I say policy, it's policies or procedures or a combination of both. You can call it what you want, we're not picky there. You have to have equipment policy and a log, cash management, financial controls, general ledgers. And when you get into this, if you're a single site, you don't have to do supplement, not supplant, because you're only working with one site. If you have multiple sites, then these things kick in. And maintenance of effort is something you report numbers from your expenses, revenues, and expenditures. And then we calculate whether you make time and effort or not. But you should have kind of a little policy that says maintenance of effort, but you should have a policy in place to kind of watch that you're going to make that every year. And comparability is only if you have multiple sites too. And then you need a travel policy. So those are the ones you need to have. Next slide. Then I want to talk about best practices. And this is what you need to have. You need your policies. You need to review them every couple of years. Check them against the federal regs to see if there's been changes, and kind of date your policies so the last time that you went in and updated them. And the charter people have given you I don't know what you want to call it, but they say you need these policies on your website. And I think they should add a few more, but we'll talk to them about that later. But make sure that all your policies are on your website so that, you know, if something happens to you, the next person can find them. If a parent wants to see the policies, they can find them. It just makes it convenient for everybody to be able to know where to go to see the policies and stuff. And if there's a federal reg or regulation, you need a policy. So it's just good practice to have all of them in one place. And, you know, make them easy to find. You know, you can have a 50,000 page binder, or you can just have them outlined on your website, whichever works for you. Next slide. And time and effort is something that the LEA gets to have a lot of say in. How do you do time and effort? And time and effort, it has to show 100% of the time worked. So you could be working with state funds, or you could be working with federal funds. You could be working with Title I, Title II, SPED. Just, you have to have it broken out into each category that you spend your time. And then it has to be, you can either do time or a percentage of your time split. You know, if you want to do, I work 80% in Title I, 20% in state funds. So, and your policy needs to be very specific of how you do it. You can do a time machine, which means they clock in and out time-wise, or you can do pen to paper, run down the hall, grab the signatures and all that stuff. But that's what your policy needs to state. A lot of times I'll get time and effort that looks really good. And you know they have a system in place because the time and effort shows that they are doing a good job collecting it. It's just that they don't have a policy. Somebody knows how they do it and they're doing it, but it's not written down. So write it down. Make sure you know how it's happening. Next slide. Okay, and equipment. The favorite thing when I go out is they say, we don't buy equipment with Title I. And that's good, but if you buy equipment with any federal fund, you need a policy. So with all that stimulus money that went out, we bought a ton of laptops, iPads, printers, you name it. You need to make sure that you have a policy and an equipment log that's reviewed every 2 years for inventory. So when we come out and we say we're doing a Title I monitoring visit, that doesn't mean we're only looking at Title I stuff, because all of your accounting procedures are your accounting procedures. All your Title I is all your time and effort is your procedures, and they cover everybody. They cover SPED, everybody. So it's not just Title I. Are you lost? Go. Go. Okay. And one of the other big issues we have is people not doing program accounting. And so every program has a code. Title I code is the 7800. And that's what I want to see when I ask for your ledgers, your budgets, where'd you put the money? This is what I want to see. And you will notice these codes, you will see these like salaries 100, benefits 200. That is what you see in Utah grants when you're requesting reimbursement. And that is where your bucket of money is. So unless anybody has a question on those, the property, including equipment, one is a real confusing line. It's line 700. That is for a purchase of something that is over $5,000. One item that costs more than $5,000. So that means you would have to use your procurement policy to do that type of purchase, and then it would be included in that line of your reimbursement request. And that should have been approved like when you did your budgets in Utah grants. But, we don't usually buy anything over $5,000 in Title I funds. So we hardly ever use that field. Next. Okay, and then we have our favorite unallowable costs. Gift cards are a no-no, because you can go purchase a gift card for $50, but that doesn't show what you spent that money on. So you would have to have a receipt that you bought, pencils for that $50, and you would have to have the receipt to go with the gift card receipt to back it up. And once you give a gift card to somebody, you don't get a receipt back. Whether you're giving it for gas or whatever, it doesn't come back. No incentives, we can't pay the kid to come to school, and we can't buy him a yo-yo if he comes to school. No incentives. And no foods, except for parent and family engagement. So if you have a parent and family engagement where there's a takeaway for the parent to work with the student at home on a task, whether it's numbers or flashcards or whatever, if they have a takeaway from a parent and family engagement, then we will pay for cheap food. We're not paying for lobster or anything like that. We're paying for a hot dog or a piece of pizza or something like that. Next. Okay. When we go out to schools, they're really cautious about talking about census and how it impacts the schools. As you know, Utah took a big hit on census information, $14 million down in Title I this last year. And it was because we just don't do the census. It's our climate. I'm from Roosevelt. Trust me, I hear it all the time. But somehow we need to just have it an easy conversation. It impacts our schools. It impacts the hospitals, roads, public work. It impacts everything in Utah. So, and this link here has some, creative ways to talk about the census. So on your Title I night, just have a light conversation. You're not going to necessarily convince anybody in one night that they should do these things, but just let's start having the conversation with people, because Utah has a lot of kids, and we do have a lot of low-income kids. Next slide. And then we need our economically disadvantaged, which comes from our school lunch voucher waiver, whatever you want to call it. So this shows that if you do reduced price meals or you get free meals, this shows you how much money you would make for a household. So a household of 4, if you make $36,000, that's the yearly, and look at what the weekly is, $694. Give them a visual, let them see what it is, because if you figure out what minimum wage is, it's nowhere near $694 a week. So not everybody learns the same way or sees the same thing. You can say, fill out the form, but give it a visual and then show them how much money your school gets because you collected these forms. So just to open this up so that it's an open conversation. Do what you need to do to get those economically disadvantaged school lunch vouchers in. And because we need the funds to come to Utah. Everybody's been hit hard with the lack of funds. So do our best. Next. So here's my contact information, and anytime you guys have a question, just give me a call. I like questions, and if anybody has a question now, I'd be happy to take them. You can stop sharing. You're on mute, Lisa.
Thank you, Tammy. Okay, not seeing any questions in the chat, so it looks like we're good to go. Thank you so much, Tammy, for sharing that information with us. We appreciate it very much.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. So next up, we had a little bit of a change. We were going to have Kira Bennett and Paula Plant, but Paula has been, she had something else to do. So I think it's Elise Newey. Is that how you say it? Okay, great. So we'll just go ahead and have you guys take it away. Oh, and they're from the Land Trust office.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, perfect. And you can see my screen okay?
Yes.
Perfect. Thank you so much. Lisa, thanks for inviting us to be here today. And thank you for all for showing up. My name is Kira Bennett, and I'm here representing the School Land Trust program. My role is compliance specialist. And I also have here with me our fabulous education specialist, Elise Newey. So with that, I'm just going to jump right in. I know some of you are veterans with our program, and others of you might not have heard much about us outside of the 5420 label. So I'm hoping to provide you with a brief refresher or introduction of who it is we are, what in our program is applicable to you and your role, and some of our suggested best practices as it comes to administering, monitoring, and undergoing compliance monitoring with our program. So the School Land Trust program, it's a really unique, and that it's not federal, and it funds education through trust lands rather than tax dollars. Trust lands originated when states admitted to the union received a grant of land from the federal government to support public education. And the reason this happened was to provide assurance that we were forming a nation with an educated populace without the capital initially available to fund this goal. Utah's Enabling Act included trust lands being typically formed from sections 2, 16, 32, and 36 in each township. And a township, as you can kind of see on this map, consists of 36 1-by-1 mile parcels called sections. And from here, funds are generated and distributed for the purposes the trust was established for through a trust system. And the trust lands owned by Utah are all these little blue dots on here. I think it's Elise that calls them measles. It kind of looks like the measles of Utah. So those are the trust generating lands. The trust system is formed by 4 different organizations that work together for the beneficiaries of the trust. There's first CITLA, and they generate revenue from any activity that land is suitable for. And so that includes things like land sales, purchasing, real estate, easements, leases, minerals, you name it. And from here, another organization, CITFO, invests the revenue and maintains a portfolio to optimize growth for the beneficiaries. And then the School Children's Trust, that's our team. We distribute a portion of this annually to public schools, and they make up about 97% of the beneficiary population. And there's also another leg of the trust, and they're called the Advocacy Office, and they participate in all things protection and advocacy for the beneficiaries of the trust. So that's who you're dealing with when you're dealing with anything trust lands related. Currently, the permanent fund managed by CITFO is at over $3 billion. And that translates into almost $101 million going out to public school beneficiaries in the next 23 to 24 distribution. The program in public schools is facilitated at the state level, but it's really managed at a local level. And this is kind of important when monitoring comes in later. To receive funds, school community councils are formed with parents, educators, and administration from schools to review and determine a school's greatest academic need that can be supported through our program's funding. And there are some restrictions on allowable use of funds and some expenditure caps. The school community council makes a plan for use of land trust funds, which is submitted for the program. And then once approved, they're able to receive those funds to support academic achievement for students. And this is where your role likely comes in with tracking and entering the expenditures for the program. Here I have some timelines and due dates that might apply to your role and interaction with SLT. And I can provide a copy of this slideshow along with other resources following this. So if you miss anything, we'll provide that for you. For a more comprehensive list of timelines that pertain to the multiple stakeholders within the processes of the program, I'll also provide some resources, and you can always reach out to us as well. And I want to preface this information by saying our program specifically views charters as an LEA. So that's important when it comes to monitoring too. If a charter LEA contains satellites, they're considered a school within that LEA. So starting over here in October, student headcounts are provided to the USBE, and these are important because distribution for our program is based on a per pupil calculation from these headcounts, with the inclusion of a guaranteed base for charters, and that's 0.04% of the total amount allocated for the charters as an entire body. Also in October is when you of course enter school expenditures into UPEFs, and I'll give some more information about this coming up. We also hope at this time that you will update contact information with us and notify us on any opening or closing charters for the next school year. In January is when UPEF's data transfers to our school land trust system for each school for the purpose of a final report that the schools are doing on how money was actually spent in the prior year. And this is the report that financial compliance reviews are done on. In January, I also send out the projections for the distribution for the upcoming year, which you will be receiving soon for 23 to 24. And I call these projections, especially for the charter bodies, because there are factors that can occur during the annual distribution that require a change for one charter. And we'll talk about that in a second. And because of how our calculation works, this impacts every single charter in the state every time one is changed. So a solidified amount can't be absolutely uncertain until distributions are sent out, but they should be fairly close, your projection, to what you will actually receive. In March, new charters will decide between taking a base or per pupil. This is a new rule that I'll go over in just a second too. And LEAs also give a report to their board on the prior year's implementation of the program. In July, a distribution is sent out, and we do send those at the LEA level. So again, if there's a charter with multiple satellites, you'll receive that as a lump sum. And then the LEA will distribute to individual schools based on either the per pupil or base amount that they're receiving. This is when I will typically start we call them full and financial compliance reviews. Although this current year is a little bit different. So what you're observing might be a little bit different than this timeline I'm going over. There's several compliance monitoring reviews that our team does throughout the year, but the one that involves any expenditures or allowable expenditures are within those two types and start in the fall. And then this cycle then repeats. So going over what may be helpful for you to do and how your role intersects with our program. The reason that I am sharing some of these best practices with you are because these components involve key pieces of what we monitor in our program and what compliance reviews are on, so you can be better prepared for any requests or having understanding of what we're looking for and why we're looking for it. So besides our office having the the responsibility of implementing this program to serve the beneficiaries, we also have to be very cognizant that this program is extremely important to legislators. And as a result, the code and rule about how our program needs to be implemented is quite extensive, which I'm sure many of you have experienced. And it's important to uphold to protect this program. So under this understanding, we monitor the implementation very closely and have the expectation that LEAs also do this at the local level. The uniqueness of our program is that in local control, facets of monitoring impact different roles within it, depending on involvement. So what you might be seeing as business administrator is going to be different than what the main district representative or the principal might be having compliance done on. So with that, head counts are extremely important for calculating the distribution. So accuracy is critical. Because of this, we ask for care in reporting and in for projections for new and opening charters. I talked about how there is a new rule changing how charter schools that are opening receive funding for their first year. So historically, you would receive a per pupil amount as a new opening charter based on a projected enrollment. The new rule states that opening charter schools can choose to receive either base or the per pupil amount based on projection in their first year. And this applies to new charter LEA schools, not satellites. So satellites will receive base their first year. The decision for if a school would like to receive the base or per pupil based on projection is due by March 1st, or the default will be that they'll receive base. So that's an important deadline to know going forward. And then in the second year, a true up is done to correct any difference between what was received versus what the actual head counts were. The next thing I'd like to talk about is our team really encourages you as a business administrator to request a login to the School Land Trust website. We do offer read-only access since you now enter all the expenditures in UPEFs, but this allows you to compare what you're entering in UPEFs to the entries that display on the School Land Trust website. So there's no disconnect between what you thought happened versus what we received that's later found in our review. It also allows us to have your contact information that we ask you to update annually, so we know who to get information over to. And the contact information on our website is also how we reach you for the January projection and how we request information in a compliance review. So it's really important that we have that information. A critical piece for our program is that when you're entering the UPEFs data for 5420 in October, to enter at the school level. So again, we recognize charters for our purposes in calculating at an LEA level, and we distribute to you at an LEA level, but the expenditures have to be at a school level. And the reason this is our website, anything that you enter into UPEFs at a LEA level is currently validated at that level, but it will not be registered by our website, and it won't show up correctly for the schools to do their final reporting, which is what we do the financial monitoring on. So there's a huge disconnect there. And any incorrect data transfer that happens as a result of that requires a kind of lengthy process and documentation that it impacts your time. And you also have to deal with corrections in both our system and UPEFs. So entering at a school level is probably one of the key components I hope you walk away with. In the compliance monitoring for our program, you'll most likely be impacted by a request for financial information. Like I said, the timeline is a little bit different this year, but typically in the fall, I'll reach out to your main LEA representative for the program and business administrator and ask for a list of detailed expenditures for 5420 broken down by individual school. And we review the program for really several different components, but financially it's to see if expenditures are allowable. And this can be impacted by proper coding in UPEFs and or mapping of the expenditure data into UPEFs. So just paying special attention to that. And it's also impacted by knowing what allowable and not allowable is for our program, which I'll provide you with some resources for. From there, we'll select a sample of the financial data to receive supporting documentation for. So anything from invoices, purchases, orders, receipts, depending on what the expenditure was. And just having that readily available makes that process more smooth. It does take a couple of months to go through that full process. In addition, something that we look at is how funds are handled at the LEA level and what control processes are in place for the school spending land trust money. And do all of the people that are involved in the spending of this money understand what those processes are? So kind of to piggyback off of Tammy's presentation, having that documented on your website and or each the principal, you knowing what the process is for your district is a pretty critical component for our program. When we conduct compliance reviews, you can expect requests for information, follow-up requests, and supporting document requests, and then a final meeting at the conclusion of the review that discusses all of the findings. Findings are addressed according to level of severity, but it's likely that the consequence of an unallowable expense would be something like paying it back to the program with another source of funding and or having additional training. And those are probably the most common. And there are other things that are monitored that have more to do with the formation of school community councils, other program requirements, timelines, and due dates. And those are available at your request, but probably won't impact you at the business administrator level. We do have several resources available for further questions that you have. So here we have our School Land Trust website, which again, I encourage you to at least get read-only access for and update your contact information. We also have a page on the Utah State Board of Education website. It's not always easy to find on the website, but if you go to the search bar and you type in School Land Trust, our page will pop up, and that'll provide you with resources and answers to common questions, along with code and rules that pertain to our program, such as things like allowable and unallowable expenses. We also have Elise, who is our education specialist with us today, and she sends out training materials typically to principals and school community councils, but she also creates content and provides group and one-on-one training, so she can customize information to your role, and she's just a phenomenal source of knowledge, so I definitely suggest using that. And then we also we're a massive team of 3. So in addition to Elise and I, there's Paula Plant, who's our director and has been with the trust since it's basically been going. And we welcome the opportunity to share any information and or questions that you have on our program. So if there's any questions, I'm happy to take them now. Otherwise, feel free to reach out to us. And I can't thank you enough for your time today.
All right, I'm not seeing any questions in the chat. So it looks like we're good. Yep. Okay, thank you so much. I appreciate you taking the time out of your day to share with us. Thank you. All right, so next up we have Neil Stevens with special education.
Good afternoon. Let me prepare my presentation. 1 moment, please. Good afternoon. My name is Neil Stevens. I am the fiscal monitoring team lead for the USBE. Our team consists of 9 individuals, including myself and Colt Shakespeare, who is the fiscal monitoring team manager. On our team, we have a variety of different programs to monitor, including special education. For special education monitors, there are currently a number of us, myself, Corey Erickson, Matthew Nye, and Jerry Rogers, and we'll be expanding our team in the near future here to be able to provide additional technical support and other resources to LEAs. So just a brief overview of our funding that we put out there is there are several different funding sources. There are 2 federal programs in most years. Last year we had 4 federal programs because of ARP funds. Those aren't represented here, but we also have a variety of many other different state programs. The biggest program and biggest funding source for special education funds is going to be the Special Education Regular Add-on Fund. And in most years, that represents about 60% of total funding that LEAs use. I present this pie chart here just to illustrate the different types of funding we put out there. Each funding has a different purpose and must be used in accordance with that purpose. For example, the state preschool funds must be used for preschool services only. It can't be used for anything above preschool. Same thing with your self-contained funds. Those for students who are in self-contained environments and are not to be used for the general special ed population that may, for example, only receive speech services or maybe small reading services per week. So here in special education, we have a variety of different ways we do monitoring. Overall, the biggest thing we're concerned with is allowability, is the way you're using your funds is at an allowable purpose. And so then we embark on different monitoring types to achieve that. Our first type we have is universal monitoring. We go, and universal monitoring encompasses a broad breadth of almost everything. Then we have sample-based monitoring, which is a smaller subset of our monitoring. Then we have risk-based monitoring that gets down into the details of not everything, but in a lot of different areas. And I'll be reviewing these things, these areas in the next few slides here. So for universal monitoring, we have several things we do monitoring of. Our first is our program level assurances. So every year, a member of your executive team will need to complete program level assurances in the Utah grants, and they're due by June 30th. Those are assurances or requirements that are found in the IDA regulations as a condition of providing services and providing and receiving special education funds. They talk about child find, they talk about drug-free workplaces, and a variety of other different requirements they have in there. Also in the assurances, we have fiscal assurances. Those come from our board rule and also from uniform grant guidance. Probably the most common fiscal assurance in there is that you have the internal controls and you have fiscal control of your fiscal resources and documentation of those resources. And you're required to assure to these items as a condition of receiving funding each year prior to June 30th. And our last part of the IDA application, the universal monitoring, is the IDA application. So we look at for a variety of things in the application. There's a risk assessment that everybody must complete, has 10 questions with 4 possible choices for each question. For IDA, we must determine that you're eligible for funds by reviewing your maintenance of effort plan. And the IDA regulation requires that an LEA budget at least the same amount or more of fiscal resources from state and local funds as the prior year. So in our application documents, we request that you provide us with a budgeted amount of state and local funds to be used in special education, and we compare it to a prior year spending levels to ensure that they are adequate. If they are not adequate, we will send the application back for review. This is part of our universal monitoring to ensure eligibility for the funds. We also look at your budget. Budgets are pretty straightforward and simple. Many times we may send it back because something's included in equipment that doesn't meet the definition of equipment. Under federal guidelines for federal funds, equipment is any one single item valued at $5,000 or more for that item. Anything valued at less than $5,000 is actually considered a supply and should be reported as such. So if you're in your budget includes computers and you put those computer purchases in the equipment line, we'll send it back to you and ask you to recode that to the supply line. And the last thing is excess costs. That's a requirement of IDA. not a requirement that I'm usually a fan of, but we are required to have LEAs complete excess cost requirements. So this would compromise the entirety of our universal monitoring efforts here. Every LEA receives these universal monitoring efforts regardless of how they spend their funds or not. This is the first step in our monitoring process. Next, we come to sample-based monitoring. So we have two ways we use sample-based monitoring, and pretty much every LEA receives sample-based monitoring because every LEA, in order to receive federal funds, needs to submit a reimbursement request. Also, in order to be eligible for federal funds, for IDA funds, you must meet maintenance of effort requirements. And so with these two things that we do for every LEA. Corey Erickson is the primary point of contact for maintenance of effort calculations. He makes the calculation from the APR, Annual Program Report, from UPEFs. We have a calculator that is provided to us by our support center that we use to calculate compliance with maintenance of effort requirements. If you do not meet in 1 year, Corey will be reaching out to you to talk to you about exceptions and adjustments. We won't go over those here because those are very detailed and lengthy to describe and present, but just know that if there is an issue with maintenance of effort, whether you have a question or we need information from you, Corey will be your point of contact for that. Next you come into is reimbursement requests. So reimbursement requests, every reimbursement for federal funds requires supporting documentation. Documentation that we generally review is time and effort documentation, detailed general ledgers, payroll ledgers, invoices, and receipts. Now, not everything's required for every request. For example, if you submit a general ledger that has only payroll on it, and that's all you're requesting, we will look at payroll, and we may look at some time and effort documentation depending on the categories which your payroll falls in. For example, if you submit a a request for payroll and the ledgers show that you paid an administrator for services that may or may not be a principal or executive director, we may ask for time and effort documentation on that to determine whether that cost is an allowable cost. Every reimbursement request does require supporting documentation. Corey Erickson and Jerry Rogers are the ones doing those reviews right now. They may request additional documentation for questions they have upon review of the general ledger. The last part is risk monitoring. This is the most intensive form of monitoring. It occurs probably between 24 and 28 times a year, depending on circumstances. We have risk assessments that we use with the application that determine which LEAs are prioritized. Higher risk LEAs are prioritized sooner in the monitoring process than the lower risk LEAs. Our goal is to review or visit every LEA at least once every 6 years. And that's the minimum requirement that the Office of Special Education Programs, otherwise known as OSEP, has decided to implement. We may do more monitoring visits if we have other concerns. Sometimes those concerns come to us in a variety of ways. It may be a complaint with our internal hotline. It may be a concern from our program monitoring team, or it may be a complaint filed through a parent with dispute resolution, or how the LEAs are implementing IEPs. Visits may be done in person, or may be virtual. That most of the time is up to the LEA. This year we're doing most of our visits virtually, and it appears that most business administrators, special directors prefer that option. So we'll continue to offer that option to all LEAs. Generally, our visits are done in coordination with the program monitoring team, otherwise known as the UPIPS team, and we schedule them together. We try and because so much of what we do in special education mixes program with fiscal resources, we try to coordinate our visits together. So if there's any concerns or findings on the program side that are communicated, and we can review those findings or impacts, how they impact the fiscal or funding side of things. If you're an LEA who hasn't been visited in the past 5 years, your LEA will be prioritized for a fiscal visit in the coming years. So when we do our fiscal monitoring site visits, we have several areas of emphasis. We'll look at internal controls, look at financial controls, we'll look at allowability. Indirect costs are considered. That doesn't apply to every LEA. Many charter schools do not use indirect cost method. And so that completely exempts that LEA from that area of consideration. Cash Management Act, federal funds are considered to be in reimbursement of funds. If funds are received before an expenditure occurs, considered a cash advance that requires computation of interest to be remitted back to the federal government. We generally discourage that, but we need to examine policy procedures to ensure that you're in compliance with that. Look at procurement policies, look at procurement, sample procurement efforts to make sure that they fall in line with your policy and also in line with any federal state rules around procurement. And lastly is time and effort. So we're looking at time and effort, make sure you have documentation of the efforts that your employees are putting forth, ensure that they comply with everything else. This is often an area of concern. So if you can take any away from today's presentation, please take away that time and effort is very important, and that to review that if you have questions, if you're compliant or not. Going forward on fiscal our site visits here, we have several areas of compliance authority that we consider. The most highest one is federal statute regarding IDA funds. Next is regulations or additional detail around those statutes. Next, look at uniform grant guidance. This particularly concerns with financial record keeping, treatment of funds, allowability, time and effort, and procurement. And we also look at state statute, and we also look at board rule. A state statute mostly concerns with allocation of funds and how funds are given to each LEA and how the formula for the allocation. That doesn't really apply here, but also there are rules around how you may use the funds, and that does apply here for when we do fiscal monitoring. And last, we look at is board rule. We have our financial board rules in section 113 and 114. We also have board rule in 750, which is a special education rules manual that does have an entire section dedicated to fiscal. And section 750 is incorporated by reference. That can be found on our special education website at the state board website. As far as documentation that we look at, we're going to be looking at detailed general ledgers. Those general ledgers need to have a fund, program, revenue, function, object codes included. This will allow us to first determine that the LEA is performing program accounting as required by board rule. We look at general ledgers, payroll ledgers that tie the general ledgers. We use this primarily to determine how employees' time is being coded to. We have several cost categories by object codes that are unallowable. So when looking at the general ledgers and payroll ledgers, we're looking for unallowable object codes to determine whether or not a cost is allowable. For example, a executive director is not allowable except in certain circumstances. So we will be looking for those object codes to determine allowability. Time and effort documentation versus do you have time and efforts? Do you have a policy around time and efforts? Time and effort documentation policy is a requirement of uniform grant guidance. Section 430 of the guidance states that you must have an internal control system to capture the appropriate time and effort that individuals perform in the program. So we're going to be looking for a policy for that. If there's not a policy there, probably write you a finding and ask you to develop a policy. We look at policy procedures around procurement, time and effort specifically. We'll look at your contracts, make sure that you have contracts in place for third-party services. And lastly, we look at educator licenses. For special education specifically, educators providing services must be licensed or under the direction of someone who is licensed in special education. So a general educator that possesses a K-12 license or elementary license, but no endorsements of special education, is not an allowable cost unless he or she is working under a licensed educator in special education. Some of our areas of concern we've had in the past, program accounting. Visited a number of LEAs this year whose program accounting and their general ledger doesn't make it all the way over to the reports in UPEFs. If a few of them have reported only revenues and expenditures in program 1205 and none in the other programs, in spite of having received funds in other programs. So we want to make sure that your program accounting that's occurring on your accounting system is making its way to the reportings and UPEFs. Looking at internal controls, make sure you have adequate policy procedures in place for areas of concern or areas of requirements for IDA and on the state side. We're going to look at allowability, make sure you haven't spent funds in unallowable ways. And we have a chart in our board rules in section 10 that by object code and function code, it tells each LEA whether or not a expenditure is allowable or not. Some of them are gray areas. We indicated with an I for contact to the state board for additional information. So if you ever come across one of those question mark costs, we ask you to contact us so we can talk through whether the cost is allowable or not for special education. Time and effort documentation is hugely important. We've run across a few LEAs this year. We've done about 18 visits so far this year, and I think at least 3 or 4 of them do not have time and effort documentation. It will be an automatic finding. It may or may not turn into a financial finding, but right now we're still working through that. Another area is procurement. One thing important about special education funds and federal funds in general is that any equipment costing over $5,000 requires prior approval from the USBE, and that's a federal requirement. So we want to make sure you have policy procedures around that to ensure that when the time comes, if you do decide to engage in procurement of those costly items, that you follow the federal requirements around procuring that. And our last thing we have here is our timeline. So we're going to start with the initial notification. You're going to receive a notification for the Utah grants that you are scheduled for a fiscal monitoring visit. It will give you a date and a time. It will provide a cover letter with the listing the items we'll be reviewing and the things that we need. If you have any questions about at that step, please give us a call, contact us, and we'll walk you through that. Next, at the actual visit, we'll do an interview between an hour and a half and 2 hours with your special education director and business administrator jointly in the meeting. We want to gauge the interaction and the cooperation between the business administrator and special education director, and also see where the responsibilities cross over in relation to the questions we have. Next, we'll be looking at our financial documentation. That'll be done here at our offices. It can take a matter of days or weeks to go through that, depending on the size and complexity of the documents we're reviewing. We may or may not request supporting documentation in addition to general ledger when we have questions about certain costs. After all that's done, we'll review all the supporting documentation and review our decisions, along with the responses to our interview questions. We'll produce an initial report. If the report has any findings there, the LEA is entitled to an appeal process. You have 30 days from the date of the report to provide a written appeal to the USB board of directors, and they will hear or schedule a way to have an appeal heard. And then after appeal is heard or appeal is or forfeited, we'll commence corrective action resolution if there are corrective actions. Generally, you have 90 days to provide any correction to any audit findings that we find. So that encompasses our monitoring efforts here in special education. If we have any questions, I'd be happy to take them.
So it doesn't look like there are any questions in the chat. So just want to thank you again, Neil, for taking time out of your day to help to present for us and help us know better how the compliance issues go. And thank everybody for being here today. Appreciate it. Good to see you all back. And we look forward to seeing you at our next meeting in February. Thanks, everybody.